Good evening. I want to say thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Very welcome to the Veterans for Peace webinar, Nuclear Power and Weapons in a Time of Rising Tensions. I'm Anthony Donovan. I'm an associate member of Veterans for Peace. This webinar was conceived and is sponsored by Veterans for Peace Nuclear Abolition Working Group. This group's purpose is to widen and help and join with others in our strategic planning for a sustained campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. In January 2022, this group put out their own nuclear posture review to preempt and counter our government's nuclear posture review, which frankly we knew would be extremely dangerous for the human race. And very truly, we've been surging ahead with our nuclear weapons. And as Linda will say, our nuclear power. The Nuclear Abolition Working Group has also fully supported all efforts supporting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They hold symposiums, had a recent webinar with Tim and Wallace of nuclearban.us regarding the lobbying and educational efforts of warheads to windmills. Steering member Jerry Condon and his wife Helen in 2015 helped save, and another VFP national project helped save and sail around the country the historic 1958 Golden Rule peace boat for nuclear abolition, for ending wars, for addressing social justice and climate justice issues, for education and inspiring our activism. Veterans for Peace business manager is Shelley Rocket, and we're very fortunate that Shelley also knows how and is operating behind the scenes the mechanics for this evening. So I want to thank you very much, Shelley. I'm really excited to say, on a very positive note, that we're about to hear from three most knowledgeable and devoted people. Linda Pentz Gunter of Beyond Nuclear, Greg Mello of Los Alamos Study Group, and William Hartung of the Quincy Institute. Not quite ready for each, thank you. I want to say the outline for this evening to our audience. The outline for this evening is going to look like this. Each of our three guests will present for approximately 15 minutes. After that, we're going to have a go round where each of our presenters will ask the other two questions that they have that might help them with their own work and to help connect our silos and the community that we're all part of. Please note that we were supposed to turn off the chat. We're trying to, and if that hasn't been happening, we're not monitoring the chat because we want to focus on the discussion of these three people. So, but it's really imperative for you to know, and the presenters want you to know, that they really welcome and wish your feedback and your questions. So after tonight, please feel free. We're going to post, for all those who've signed up, we are sending you an email with the link to this webinar, as well as how to contact each one of our presenters and also their websites and the information they talk to you about tonight. So hopefully that will help. So once again, please mute yourselves, and I'm sorry about that. Okay, so today, just briefly, the moment we open up our computer, we are deluged with dire turn of events. But tonight we have those who exemplify tremendous courage and wisdom to face squarely this out of control nuclear arms race, which our nation is leading, along with its fomenting unspeakable wars against all law, all without any of our promised democratic process or input from we, the people. So today is the solstice. It's the longest day of light. And I'm just very excited that the Veterans for Peace and myself are very excited to have this presentation, this discussion between three beautiful, devoted, working tirelessly over a lifetime, bravely speaking truth to power for common sense and for all life in this one small, precious planet. So I'm going to start off introducing Linda Pentz Gunter. And get Linda up on the screen. Linda has been devoted to nuclear activism since the 1990s. She was a journalist for 20 years in print and broadcast and remains so. She's written featured articles in the UK daily newspaper, the Morning Star, Reuters, among others, Ralph Nader's Capitol Hill Citizen. In 2007, she founded the organization Beyond Nuclear. Beyond Nuclear works to support grassroots, national, and international efforts to phase out nuclear power in favor of safer energy choices to address the climate crisis. It's a tremendous, her nuclear, her organization is a tremendous resource. Please tune into it. It's keeping an ever careful eye on the truth, on the lies and the scandals of our nuclear energy enterprises, as well as its inseparable connection to the nuclear weapon industry here and around the world. Linda's goal was to reach beyond the immediate circle of us committed anti-nuclear and peace activists and engage environmentalists concerned with the climate crisis and the necessity to move away from fossil and fissile energy use. She's also the curator and editor for Beyond Nuclear International, which highlights personal stories affecting people around the world. One of the several publications this week that I read gives us a deep history of the great suffering of our brothers and sisters in the Congo over its uranium source. So Linda, it's an honor, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, the honor is all mine, certainly, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to just start sharing my slides now. Hopefully you can all see it. And I wanted to begin with a quote. "We are sleepwalking into a catastrophic global conflict. Our political class shows no interest in de-escalation, diplomacy, or restraint, and it is always other people's children who pay the price in a world of endless war. Who pay the price. In a world of endless war, we need voices for lasting peace." And that's a quote from Jeremy Corbyn, who's the former leader of the UK Labour Party. I put that quote up partly because I wanted to thank all of you who are on this today, especially members of Veterans for Peace, for being voices for lasting peace. I don't think anybody understands the devastation of war better than people who've been involved in it. So thank you all for what you're doing for peace. Our leaders are sleepwalking us into fundamentally two existential threats, and they look rather eerily similar in these pictures. One is nuclear war, obviously. We used to always talk about that as the sort of immediate push-button threat, and climate change as sort of the oncoming one. But now we know that the climate catastrophe is very much with us. Right now, a lot of us are sitting under a heat dome even this week. Nuclear war is of great concern, especially right now, as the title of your evening suggests. We've got nuclear-armed Israel engaged in a genocide in Gaza. We've got nuclear-armed Russia in Ukraine. We've got nuclear-armed NATO. So there are a lot of ingredients there for a potential conflagration. And of course, we've got the climate catastrophe, which has the great capacity to contribute to war. A lot of the stresses that we see from the existential threat of the climate crisis right now, such as drought, floods, fires, famine, energy poverty, mineral access, uninhabitable lands, and mass migration, are all known triggers for conflict and even for war. And of course, if there's war, there could easily be nuclear war. And so we have to really fundamentally tackle these two threats together, the threat of nuclear war and the threat of the climate catastrophe. And there's an impediment to doing that that's in the way of addressing both of these, and that is the proverbial nuclear elephant in the room. It is in the way of a true nuclear weapons ban. It makes it fundamentally impossible if you leave the door open to the development of nuclear weapons by keeping nuclear power in place. And it also impedes progress on climate mitigation because it detracts from what we should be doing. And I'm going to get to more detail on each of these in a minute, but what I wanted to address was something you mentioned at the beginning right away, Anthony, which is the whole issue of silos, that our movements tend to be very siloed. We've got the nuclear ban movement, which sort of, accepts this inalienable right to develop nuclear power as part of the deal. And then within the nuclear ban movement, we've also got an unwillingness to take on opposition to nuclear power, for a variety of reasons. And then on the climate side, we've got a similar situation where we've got activists within the climate movement who sort of accept the propaganda that maybe we need to keep the current nuclear power plants in place because they're low carbon and they're here now, so perhaps they're okay. And of course, the climate movement is very much focused on getting rid of fossil fuels and not very focused on the nuclear issue. And then we've got, obviously, the whole issue of what is it about nuclear power that makes it the pathway to the bomb? And I'm just going to move something here because I can't see my slides. If I can, I guess I can't move them. But the fundamental problem with nuclear power is that it is the recipe for transitioning to nuclear weapons. So we've seen this historically already happen with the nuclear weapons programs of India, Pakistan, Israel, which officially doesn't have nuclear weapons, and North Korea, who all came about the nuclear weapons technology through being introduced to so-called civil technology, whether it be to make electricity or whether it be research reactors. And of course, now we have Iran, which has become sort of the poster child of what's wrong with trying to separate these two, because Iran originally, when it was part of the so-called Iran agreement, was only enriching uranium up to civil reactor grade. But now, after Trump walked away from that agreement, they've continued to enrich uranium to at least 60% by their own admission. And so no one really is sure whether Iran is headed towards a nuclear weapons program. The headlines in the paper today suggest they very much are and could get there very quickly. Iran continues to say that's not what they're doing. But it just exemplifies the really blurry line between the civil nuclear sector and the military nuclear sector. The other thing is that the small modular reactors that are being talked about all the time right now are absolutely connected to the whole issue of keeping the nuclear military going. And as you can see from that quote on the screen, it's absolutely inherent to what the nuclear navy needs, that flow of personnel, know-how, technology keeps going. And the other issue with these so-called new modular reactors, some of them are small, some of them are micro reactors, is that they are almost all of them what is known as fast reactors, which means they are reliant on a kind of enriched uranium fuel that is more enriched than the traditional fuel for civil reactors and is very proliferation friendly. So there's a real danger, as you see people like Bill Gates wanting to export these all over the world, that this will again be used as the pathway to the bomb. And then we come to the treaties, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, also known as the NPT, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also known as the TPNW. Both have enshrined in the language that the pathway to the bomb is an inalienable right for signatories to develop research, production, and use of nuclear energy for so-called peaceful purposes. So that's a real problem in keeping the door open. And then we have to look at how nuclear power impedes progress on the other existential threat, which is the climate crisis. Nuclear power is fundamentally too slow and too expensive. That would be the way to sum it up quickly. That means that if you choose a slower, more expensive energy choice, nuclear power, you're diverting time and money away from what you could be doing much faster to get greater carbon reduction sooner for the same investment. So it is a foolish choice to go on that path. Choosing nuclear power means you're going to displace less fossil fuel per dollar per year than buying efficiencies or renewables instead. And then, of course, you hear this thing about it being carbon free, which is, of course, total nonsense. I mean, not even renewables are carbon free. But even if nuclear was carbon free or low carbon, it is still, because it's too slow and too costly, the worst choice to use to address reducing carbon emissions and mitigating the climate crisis. So for all these reasons and many more that I don't have time to get into, it is in the way. And so what you hear out there all the time are what I would call the two major red herrings. One is we need the current reactors for climate. That's not true, because most US nuclear reactors now cost more to operate than their output can earn. They also cost more than providing the same services through new renewables or by using electricity more efficiently. That data is found in the work of Amory Lovins and also in our talking points on the Beyond Nuclear International website. So again, it's a detour away from doing what you could do fast. And the other one is we need new nuclear power plants for climate change. I mean, apart from the fact that they will never get here in anything like the numbers we need for the climate crisis we're in now, in time to do anything remotely meaningful. The real motivation for getting them anyway is, again, as you can see from the slide, this quote, to feed and serve the needs of the nuclear military. That's the agenda, and that's why we push so heavily. So why is nuclear power in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? This treaty that we were so overjoyed to see and welcomes so warmly, and yet has in its preamble this inalienable right to have access to nuclear power. And I asked that question. I wasn't integrally involved in getting the TPNW done. And what I was told was that it came actually as a prerequisite for signing the treaty from countries predominantly in the global south and what they call the non-aligned states. And they saw it as an equity issue. And so we've all been so-called benefiting from having access to nuclear power all these years. So you cannot introduce a treaty in which you forbid us that same equitable right to make that choice if we so wish. And they have a word for this. It's called newtopia. And unfortunately, the propaganda has been bought that nuclear is prestigious, equitable, modern, necessary, and reliable. Argue that it is quite the reverse. It's very much a no-topia. If you look at the history so far that Anthony also alluded to at the beginning, it's colonialist, predatory, racist, unnecessary, unsuitable. And I just put up 4 examples of this in these slides. That first picture is from Niger. It is a young man in Arlit, which is a uranium mining town, collecting water, because despite all the profits that are made by the French uranium mining company there in exporting that uranium, the people who live there and work those mines often don't have running water or even electricity, and not healthy, clean water either. The woman on the right is from the Vogel community in Georgia, where burying her dead, where again, in a minority, predominantly minority community, African-American, there's a rampant amount of cancers from living close to the Vogel 1 and 2 reactors that have already opened. And of course, the Savannah River site, the big nuclear reprocessing facility, and they deeply oppose the next 2 Vogel reactors as well. Then, of course, nuclear power can go very badly wrong. I'm not actually going to address the Ukraine situation because I've talked about that a lot in the past, Zaporizhia and other reactors there, but obviously the potential for a catastrophe is very great when you have reactors in a war zone, but it can happen just on a bad day, as occurred in Chernobyl and as occurred in Fukushima. And the picture there of the thyroid test is unfortunately part of the sad story of the aftermath of Fukushima and Chernobyl, where there was a lot more increase in thyroid cancer. And lastly, we get to the waste issue. And that, again, in this country has been by and large targeted at Native American communities. That picture is actually from the Goshu Indian Reservation in Utah, which defeated an attempt to dump nuclear waste on their land. As we all know, Yucca Mountain, which at the moment is off the books still for high-level radioactive waste, is on Western Shoshone land. So again, it's the same story of who gets harmed. And nothing really tells that story better than the Congo, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, which just has an extraordinary legacy of stories that connect nuclear power and nuclear weapons together, and this whole sort of colonialist predatory story. So the Congo was the place where the US got most of its uranium, 80% of the uranium that was used in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs for the Manhattan Project came from the Shinkolobwe mine in the Congo. When Patrice Lumumba came to power in 1960, he was the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo. Katanga province, which is where that uranium mine is, seceded from the country. And so Lumumba went to the UN to try to get help with this rebellion, and he was rebuffed. So he then turned to the Soviet Union. That sealed his death sentence fundamentally. He was assassinated 6 months after he came to power, ostensibly because he might be taking the country down the communist route. But what's also come to light is that MI6 from the UK and the intelligence services from the US conspired to get rid of him, to get him assassinated, because they were worried that he was going to turn over the entire inventory of uranium from the Shinkolobwe mine to the Soviets. Then we get to the fascinating story, which I encourage you to read elsewhere. I don't have time to do the details, about Operation Plumbat, which was how Israel managed to continue to get access to uranium for its nuclear weapons program after France cut them off, which was the primary supplier of arms as well. But after the Arab-Israeli war in '67, they stopped doing that. So they launched this subterfuge smuggling expedition to the Congo, in which they smuggled out 200 tons of uranium yellowcake, ships flagged from different countries, fake owners, an exchange of cargoes on the high seas, and smuggled it into Dimona. Is a fascinating tale, which I encourage you to read. So today, the Congo, largely because of the potential profit making from gold, from cobalt, from uranium and other minerals, has been the scene of a terrible genocide, at least 6 million people dead already. And it's never talked about. And if you want the answer to the question about why it's never talked about, I encourage you to look at that photo. And today, of course, the Shinkolobwe mine, which has been closed, is being eyed very closely by countries like China and France, because they are trying to expand and accelerate their reactor programs. So how did Israel get its non-existent nuclear weapons, which don't officially exist? There are presumably thought to be between 80 and 400 of them. This is a picture of what's known as Dimona. It's technically the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center. It was established with support from the French in the 1950s as a research facility. The Israelis always denied that it was a nuclear weapons facility, although there were suspicions right from the beginning, documented in CIA files and elsewhere that have now been declassified, that everybody thought that that's what was going on. So it began in 1958. It went critical in the early 60s. It was weapons ready by the mid to late 60s. And again, when France cut off the supply of uranium, it smuggled this 200 tons from the Congo. And that picture of Dimona is really a cause for concern now, because it appears to be being expanded, but no one knows quite why. So I just want to finish with a shout out for an Israeli voice for peace. Most of you probably know who Mordechai Vanunu is. As you can see, he was somebody that was very much admired by another great whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg. And Mordechai revealed the details of Israel's nuclear weapons programs in 1986, for which he was rewarded with 18 years in prison, 11 of them in solitary confinement. And since then, in talking to reporters or trying to leave the country, he's had to face additional jail time, and in fact cannot leave the country. So he seemed a good person to applaud today, as I applaud all of you for being voices for lasting peace. This is just a slide as requested with my contact information, so you don't have to rush to write this down, because it will be sent to you in the email afterwards, but it gives you an idea of how to find me. And as Anthony said, on the Beyond Nuclear International site, which is our news site, there are some longer articles which flesh out a lot of the stories that I've just alluded to in this quick presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Excellent, excellent. So we are now going to move, and we'll be coming back to Linda. We're now going to move to William Hartung, Bill Hartung. If you were around in the late 1970s into the 80s, you would recognize the name William Hartung. During the Nuclear Freeze campaign, which fostered the largest march in our history against nuclear madness in June 1982, which we do not have to repeat again. People stood up and we're counted. We know the people don't want these weapons. But Bill was researching and writing then about nuclear weapons and their budgets and our economic priorities back in that time. He hasn't stopped. For decades, Bill is considered a reliable expert a voice on the arms industry in general and our U.S. military budget. He was director of Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy and the co-director of the Center's Sustainable Defense Task Force. Almost 30 years ago, he authored the HarperCollins book, Weapons for All. 13 years ago, he authored the book, Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex, among several other works. He's contributed to numerous radio and TV programs, and in 2017 participated in several panels to help the Conference on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons become the international treaty that it is. Bill is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute, an institute that abhors war and forces facts and cooperation around the world. And it's a great, great resource center as well as Beyond Nuclear. Interesting, in this deadly serious business that we're all faced with, Bill Hartung, for the past couple of years, can be found on stages around the country, actually, but here in New York, doing stand-up comedy. So, Bill, thank you very much for being here. It's a real honor to have you, always. God bless.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. You are making me feel old, but it's accurate, so I can't complain. I would say, my main goal in my career has been to create material and research to aid, abet, fuel, help advocates and organizers, who I think are the real heroes in these matters. So I'm going to talk about the profiteers of Armageddon, the role of greed and money in perpetuating the nuclear arms race. I think it'll be clear for my co-panelists why this notion that nuclear weapons could protect us is blatantly false, and the risk that we face. I particularly appreciate Lyndon talked about the relationship of the Congo to the development of nuclear weapons and all the suffering that went on there, because even when they're not being dropped because of radiation, because of the way people are treated to get hold of the materials, people are dying because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I think it's important not to forget that. But certainly one of the reasons that we have not turned things around yet is because there's money to be made. The Congressional Budget Office estimates we'll spend over $750 billion in the U.S. on nuclear weapons in the next decade for nuclear warheads, nuclear bombers, nuclear missiles, nuclear submarines, and also deploying and maintaining them. And probably about half of that money will go to contractors. So you have companies like Northrop Grumman, which makes the new bomber and the ICBM. Lockheed Martin makes submarine-launched ballistic missiles. General Dynamics makes ballistic missile submarines. Raytheon makes cruise missiles. You've got firms like Honeywell, Bechtel, even universities like University of California, Texas A&M, that help run the nuclear warhead complex and profit in that way. And a good resource to get a kind of a snapshot of what the big nuclear companies is International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons does an annual on both the financiers and the producers of nuclear weapons. It covers companies in China, France, Italy, Russia, China. So it's hard to get a perfect picture. There's a lot of secrecy. Different governments have different levels of transparency. But needless to say, many of the countries are going full speed ahead on a next generation of nuclear weapons, which they call modernization. I don't see how that term really applies to finding weapons that could end life as we know it. So there's been a little bit of attention to nuclear weapons in the U.S. press because the new ICBM that Northrop Grumman is building has increased in estimated cost by 37% in 2 years. And it's now going to cost perhaps $315 billion over its lifetime, which is the biggest single cost of all the components of this nuclear buildup. So this cost increase violates a provision that says when a weapon system has cost growth beyond a certain amount, it has to be reviewed. In theory, The Pentagon could even cancel the program, but of course, they're not going to do that. They could stretch it out. They could take money from elsewhere, or they could just increase the top line of the budget to pay for it, which is often what happens. But in any case, it's been a rallying point for some groups to say, let's cancel this program. Let's get rid of ICBMs altogether. And there's going to be a kind of shadow congressional hearing later in the month. So it's drawn attention to one of the most elements of the nuclear arsenal. And I think it's a start. I think there's a lot of work that's been done that's kind of at the margins. Let's pick off this weapon, let's slow down this weapon, based on what people think Congress will accept. But, given that this is a global emergency, what Congress will accept cannot be our lodestar of what we decide to do. This economic force goes back to the beginning of the nuclear age, when Eisenhower gave his speech. It was mostly because of pressure he got from industry and the military to build new nuclear weapons. The immediate source of conflict was the complex wanted a new nuclear bomber. Eisenhower didn't think it was necessary. He was a bit of a, fiscal conservative, and that led to some unfortunate results. Like, he thought instead of building up a lot of troops to fight large wars on the ground, you would build up your nuclear forces and threaten to obliterate the other side, or you would overthrow governments, as happened in Guatemala and Iran. So it wasn't that Eisenhower was so positive. It was just that he had a disagreement about how much to spend on nuclear weapons. And so, even people in the uniformed military who, in theory, were in his change of command, were criticizing him publicly. The companies were taking out advertisements in major newspapers, pushing these products that Eisenhower didn't want to build. And then, in a related matter, there was the missile gap, where the contractors, some of the intelligence community and others, ginned up this false story that the United States was falling behind the Soviet Union in building long-range nuclear missiles. It was exactly the opposite. But during the end of the 50s, people like John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Stuart Symington were attacking Eisenhower from the right, saying he was soft on defense, that he wasn't building enough missiles. This, of course, was a general who had helped in World War II. It just shows that this kind of smear campaign can work in almost any circumstance. But anyway, so these were the kinds of things that led Eisenhower to warn about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. And in parallel to that, the military services, given that Eisenhower was putting so much emphasis on spending on nuclear weapons, were jockeying for position. The Air Force had an advantage because they were building bombers, they were building land-based missiles, but the Navy came to figure out how to put nuclear missiles on submarines. And then there was a bureaucratic turf war where they each developed their own doctrine for nuclear weapons that favored the kind of weapons that they built. So the Air Force said, well, we need accurate weapons that can take out the other side weapons, counterforce. Navy said, no, we need sufficiency where we can, we'll do so much damage to their society that they wouldn't dare attack us, which was more relevant to the less accurate missiles that they made at that time. A lot of this is very well laid out in Fred Kaplan's book, Wizards of Armageddon. But it got so bad that they were arguing, well, who gets to choose the targets, what we're going to target? And when the Air Force got that right, they basically could affect what kind of weapons were built. And so one of the admirals in the Navy said that the Air Force was worse than the communists because they snuck around, behind closed doors and cut into the Navy's budget. And some people even said that they saw each other as greater enemies than the Soviet Union was in this fight for money. But what happened was they made peace. And the way they made peace was the military budget was raised high enough that both services could be accommodated. They could build large numbers of submarines, large numbers of land-based missiles, large numbers of bombers. And for the most part, it's been a united front ever since. The what they call the nuclear triad, the land-based, sea-based, air-based nuclear weapons, has become sort of sacrosanct in the elite circles, as if we couldn't possibly live without it. When in fact, the more nuclear weapons we have of any sort, the less safe we are. So moving to the present, or close to the present, at the time of the New START treaty, part of the bargain that was made to get Republicans on board was to throw even more money into the nuclear warhead complex, which Greg is one of the biggest experts on. So it was a devil's bargain. We'll spend more nuclear weapons. We'll get this treaty. And this was the president who, got the Nobel Prize for allegedly wanting to abolish nuclear weapons. And then there was some focus at a certain point on ICBMs because in a crisis, the president would have a few minutes to decide whether to use them. There was a feeling by former Secretary of Defense Perry and others that this short time frame could lead to an accidental nuclear war because of a false alarm. So there was some emphasis on, let's get rid of those first. But there's a lobby for ICBMs built around a group of senators from relatively small states like Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, Utah, where they either have major ICBM bases or a lot of work is being done on the new ICBM. And although a relatively small group, they've pretty much succeeded in limiting reductions in ICBMs, limiting cuts in the budgets of the ICBMs, looking at alternatives to ICBMs, even doing studies. They even, when there was one of the nuclear treaties, there were about 50 silos that were empty. They lobbied to keep them in so-called warm status rather than destroying them. So if we built up again, they'd be ready to go. And of course, these senators are backed up by Northrop Grumman and the other big producers, and pretty much every big company has a piece of the ICBM. Lockheed Martin has a piece, General Dynamics has a piece. So they've got all that money and lobbying power. They spend tens of millions of dollars a year on campaign donations, and the 11 companies that build the ICBM, between them, employ 300 lobbyists. So there's a lot of power there. And if anything, their kind of blatant sort of profit seeking is getting worse. There was a congressional commission on posture, which came out with a report saying we should build more of almost everything, more warheads, more submarines, more bombers. And they had a hearing on it in the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is one of the most disgraceful things I've seen in my entire life, because the members, instead of asking, does this make sense? What strategy are you pushing? The majority of them gave little speeches about some wonderful weapon or facility in their state. The missile in Arizona, the test site in Nevada, and so forth. So it was a huge abdication of their responsibility on a life and death issue. Senator Warren finally turned and asked the simple question, what is this all going to cost? And John Kyle, the co-chair, who was a deadly enemy of any kind of arms control when he was in the Senate, and also worked for a stint as a lobbyist for Northrop Grumman, the biggest nuclear weapons producer in the country. Kyle said, well, cost was no object because, it's just too urgent. And it ends up, if you looked at the whole commission, the majority of them either work for consulting firms that were related to nuclear weapons, think tanks that got money from nuclear weapons producers, or people right in the middle of it, like John Kyle. And despite those conflicts of interest, the absurdity of the idea of building more nuclear weapons now, that commission has got a bit of traction in the press. And so it's another thing we have to push back against if we're going to get rid of these things altogether. I think I'm pretty much covered what I want. What I will say is the only time that we have ever made progress in shifting course, whether it be stopping above ground testing, reducing numbers, getting tactical nuclear weapons off of ships, stopping the occasional warhead program and so forth, is when there's been a movement. The ban the bomb movement in the 50s, European nuclear disarmament, freeze movements in the 80s. There's a lot of important work being done now by communities that were affected by nuclear testing to get compensation, be it the Marshall Islands, be it New Mexico. There's a new film out called First We Bombed New Mexico that highlights the organizing that's being done there to expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, because New Mexico was never covered under that. And I think those efforts, they underscore the damage that this arms race does even before the catastrophic possibility of the weapons being used. And I think people fighting back and making some progress against those odds is very inspiring on an issue that can be so deadly and so depressing and so kind of the kind of thing that people want to put out of their mind. But truth is, nobody puts it out of their mind. You know, whether they think about it consciously or not, it's kind of a cloud over our existence. So anyway, I'm glad to be on this panel, you know, with Linda and Greg, and I'm glad you all are here. We have work to do, but we should remember that, you know, humanity has beaten back huge injustices in the past, and as big as this problem seems, it's not something we should give up on because we have no choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. Yes. God bless. We'll be coming back to Bill. Greg Mello. Thank you very much, Greg, for being here. Greg is a co-founder of Los Alamos Study Group and has led its diverse, brave activities since 1989, which have included policy research, environmental analysis, congressional education, lobbying, community organizing, litigation, and advertising. Greg has served as consulting analyst and writer for other nuclear policy organizations. He originally was educated as an engineer and a regional planner and led his first environmental enforcement at Los Alamos National Laboratory. He was a hydrogeologist for the New Mexico Environment Department and later a consultant to the industry. In 2002, Greg was a visiting research fellow at Princeton's program on science and global security.
I have them.
Greg,
Okay.
can I ask everyone?
Wait,
I'm sorry. Can we ask people to mute, please? Sorry. Thank you very much. We're going to cut that out. So Greg's opinions have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, Issues in Science and Technology, and in the New Mexico Press and elsewhere. Greg has bravely and often stood up alone and questioned and attempts to broaden our authorities' scope at the annual Nuclear Deterrence Summit, where I've seen him the past 2 years in DC, but he's been going for years to that horror show. In 2017, he contributed to an important video statement in the weeks before the signing of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN in support of nations to sign. So I thank you very much, Greg, for being here. It's all yours. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much, Anthony. It's really an honor to be here with all of you, with the fellow panelists, and with Veterans for Peace, which is an outstanding organization. And so I'll see what I can do that might be able to add a few things to the wonderful points that have already been made. I guess I should share my screen now. Before I do, I just want to say, to follow up something that Bill said, the new internal ground rules of the Warhead Agency of the United States, the National Nuclear Security Administration, are organized around the realization that they are no longer cost constrained. They have absorbed this idea and they don't consider themselves cost constrained anymore. This sort of sums up the talk. It was difficult to really pare down and try to get to what seemed to be the most focused and important things that could be shared that would fit in a 15-minute spot. And so that's what we're attempting to do here. We put some links here which you can see later. And my contact information is there. I work here with my wife, Trish, and with our young assistant, Rebecca, or Bex. And we have, you know, a larger group around us, some of the time at least. So this is more or less the sum of it. We have come to the conclusion here that we should focus very carefully on stopping nuclear war. We'll return to all of these in detail. And I have been reading Bill's work for years about the nuclear weapons budget, about the defense budget as a whole. It's foundational for all of our work. And so in addition to cutting the budgets for nuclear weapons, we think we can build a movement around cutting the national security budget overall. We notice, the next point, we notice that there are possible new political alliances available, and we have found in our work in Washington, which has been fairly extensive, that we find allies in places that we wouldn't wouldn't think we'd find. Like, for example, even in Stratcom. We see powerful external events coming that will both hinder us and help us. So that's the overall sum of what I wanted to say here now. Okay, this is just a little history of us. And I think I misinterpreted Anthony's request about what we were up to lately. Well, we are working heavily on the question of nuclear weapons modernization policy, especially warheads, and especially within that plutonium warhead cores, which is a huge project. Really, it's the biggest part of the warhead enterprise in the United States. It's all told, it's more expensive than the Manhattan Project as a whole. It's something that has come up again and again over the last 35 years. We have so far killed 3 or 4 attempts to restart plutonium pit production, but we're not winning right at the moment. We work a fair bit on opposition to the Ukraine war, and a little bit on opposition to the slaughter in Gaza and Palestine more generally. So I'm going to make this recommendation. We decided that we were in a real crisis now, and that for nuclear disarmament, and for preventing nuclear war, and for preventing a wider conventional war, and to restart some kind of arms control, as well as chipping away at our national security state, which we now see as very powerful, much more powerful than it was say 10 years ago, and dismantling the US attempt to control the world, that the Ukraine war is central in all of these, central and necessary. So you could say, if we want disarmament, we're going to need peace. And to win the peace, we're going to have to make it an actual political priority. And we are concerned that we don't see this happening very much in the anti-nuclear community, in fact, or anywhere else. In the 80s, I would say that there was a closer unity between the peace community and the anti-nuclear community. And so many of us were involved in anti-war work before the Los Alamos Study Group. And we see the war, which we are now in, now wars, plural, and a threatened war in East Asia, as right in the center of the road, blocking our path. We haven't seen significant nuclear disarmament in the past decade. We see the nuclear weapons program of the United States as growing and evolving. We fight these individual programs, but it's a difficult fight. Yes, the Sentinel silo-based missile is a wonderful rallying point, and we ought to oppose it. But in the present climate of war hysteria and Russophobia and Sinophobia, it is very difficult to oppose successfully any nuclear weapons program. And we want to win. We've won before, we want to win again. We see Congress not doing oversight in general. Insiders who are in the oversight business on Capitol Hill tell us that they don't think Congress is doing any oversight anymore. Long-standing civil servants who have a more objective overview, perhaps. Here at Los Alamos, it's so bad we are spending $22 billion on what's going to be a temporary factory. That's so we can add warheads for the Sentinel system that we will be able to deploy after the New START treaty expires. And as Bill mentioned, there are many provocative nuclear policy steps being proposed not just by the Nuclear Posture Commission that he spoke of, but elsewhere also. Meanwhile, internationally, the Russians no longer think that the United States is agreement capable because we have unilaterally abandoned treaties, and they are fielding advanced nuclear systems like Poseidon that aren't covered by treaties, and they are no longer interested in old-fashioned arms control, and they won't be for a long time to come. We are at war with Russia. Meanwhile, China is expanding its arsenal fairly rapidly. And as of this week, Russia has some kind of mutual defense treaty with North Korea. And so we are literally attacking strategic nuclear targets inside Russia. So what are they telling? What does all this say? We have lost the battle for nuclear disarmament for a generation. It's not the fault of any of us here. We've been working hard. Everybody's been working hard, but we're back-footed at this point. And we immediately need to prevent a wider war, which may mean nuclear war, as well as heal or soothe the war hysteria that grips Congress, which prevents any progress. And I would like to also express the view that we can, I think we should feel free to talking about cutting U.S. nuclear weapons unilaterally if we want. That's something that we here support, and we don't really see a reason why we can't start talking about it. We were very involved in negotiating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We were there at almost every negotiation. And unfortunately, the United States is not going to sign this treaty. We never thought that it was that kind of a treaty. We never thought it was like a direct disarmament treaty. The purpose of it was something else. The purpose of it was to stigmatize nuclear weapons, create conditions, and if possible, if we could get it into the treaty, which we've largely failed at, was to make it nuclear deployments very problematic. So actually materially block the deployment and use of nuclear weapons. But the more conservative parts of the coalition wouldn't go for that. We think that it'd be easier to organize around cutting the military budget deeply than cutting nuclear weapons budget. Because, they say it's $100,000 a minute on nuclear weapons, but it's $2 million a minute on the military budget as a whole. I think it's, roughly it's $7,600 per year. It's a real lot of money. Our experience is that political parties around us are subverting a lot of the work that is going on. And the same is true for some of the biggest controlling funders of nonprofits. And I'm close, but I think we're in New Mexico. We are very close to the issues. So we're a kind of nuclear colony. We have more nuclear weapons than any other single place in the world, just like within 5 miles of us right here. And we have the largest 2 nuclear facilities in dollar terms within a 2-hour drive. Well, 30 minutes that way or 2 hours the other way. We are looking very at this from the ground level, from the point of view of a kind of internal nuclear colony. And so we see details. And so the details are telling us that, yes, nuclear power is related to nuclear weapons, as Linda said, but when you get right down in the nitty-gritty details, not as much. We are seeing historical issues used as a way to avoid dealing with current issues. In fact, we're seeing pretty much any excuse to avoid dealing with current nuclear weapons policy issues in the real political world right now. The cleanup of nuclear weapon sites, yes, very important, but it is part of the social contract at these sites that facilitates keeps the natives quiet, as it were. And we see a downside in in being vaguely anti-nuclear. So that's one side of the coin, if you want to say. The other side is they're different. So we see a lot of our politicians pick the easy parts of being anti-nuclear and use them to placate their constituents. So pretty much around here, everybody is in favor of providing, extending RECA and helping the Trinity downwinders. And we are in favor of this also. However, the problem is that the politics of this become very messy because these are the same politicians who are very much in favor of expanding the nuclear weapons arsenal, as well as nuclear power. And as far as their constituents and the news media are concerned, they can pretty much hide behind the Trinity downwinders. So that's kind of how it works here. We want basically to orient ourselves toward winning first immediately, because we're in a very dangerous situation, and also realistic ways to win in the relatively near future in the 1 to 3 year range. Let's see, well, these other points, I think I might be out of time. You'll see them online, so you'll be able to go back to this. I do want to say that there are efforts by large funders, there have been for a long time, to try to dilute, distract, divide, and shut down both the peace movement and the effective opposition to nuclear weapons in this country, and it's reasonably well documented. And so it's not like well, anyway, that's enough on that. What's been difficult for us to grasp, and we don't have all the answers, or we have almost no answers, but we're in a brand new world. We've gone to Washington a lot, hundreds of meetings with people on Capitol Hill, and it's very different now. We pretty much subscribe to the idea that the actual controlling power in the United States has flipped, so that we are more like a war machine that has a government than a government that has a war machine. Michael Glennon, his thesis of double government, is, you know, a mainstream version of that. At the same time, the international order that has been led by the United States is very much crumbling. And this is a new world. In some ways it's dangerous, in other ways it's an opportunity. Finally, we have the country as a whole is in trouble internally, financially, and socially and politically. And so there's both, this makes a lot of things difficult, and it makes some things may get handed to us on a plate. So right now there's lots of money for the military. We can, and I think we should, try to condition events so that people realize that their future is being stolen from them by the prophets of Armageddon that Bill spoke of, and that the young people who we see around us, that they basically see no coherent future. They are difficult to organize for that reason, and we can't see a successful single issue mass movement for nuclear weapons materializing under these circumstances. But there may be a broader movement for justice in the United States, and for the basic things that people actually need for their families, and at the same time, the government, as the GAO, as the director of the GAO said to me in February, no, they will not get everything they want. They are going to have to pare this down. And that's what we think too. And that the present domination of the national security state is actually incompatible with our national survival. And to the extent that our leaders and the media and the population as a whole begins to understand this, then we can start making some serious progress. I think that's it. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Greg. Wow. I just love hearing the three of you. You're all so brave, so dedicated. I got an email this morning from Mike Ferner of Veterans for Peace saying, well, I hope this presentation's not going to be like a litany of horrors. And then also Jerry Cannon said, well, the purpose of this is that we hope to connect some vital dots that will help inspire our activism. So you all, truth is power. And the three of you have been working really hard to get us the truth. You're not afraid of it. You're going into it, and you're getting it up for us. So I deeply thank you. We're going to now move into a little conversation mode. Continue this. We have about 20 minutes or so more. We're going to start with, we're going to ask Linda Pentz Gunter to come on and ask Greg a question, and also Bill. And we're going to start, and then after that, we'll move down the line with Bill. And so, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Linda, yeah.
Wow, I
know.
got the uphill challenge, I think, because
Yeah.
there's so much to take on board there, and you know, a great outline from both of you in terms of all the challenges we face. I think we do need to talk a little bit about the solutions. One of the interesting statistics I heard today, I can't remember the source, I think it was a new analysis or study, was that 85% of the world's population would like us to drop our conflicts and focus on addressing the climate crisis and get on with it, because obviously if we don't do that, nothing else matters anyway. And I suspect, I don't know if a similar analysis has been done about nuclear weapons, but I'm assuming that that number might even be higher in terms of, you know, nobody other than the people that you've talked about today want nuclear weapons. The arms manufacturers, the people in Congress, the captured politicians, most of us don't want it. So what are, I guess this is a question for both of you really, are there some, given what we're up against with the incredible lobbying power of the arms manufacturers, this compulsion that seems to have taken over our politicians to do exactly the wrong thing about everything and continue to do it despite the empirical evidence that shows them that it's the wrong thing, and that's across wars, nuclear weapons, nuclear power, etc. What can we, all of us in, beyond this room, actually really do in terms of a meaningful, tangible suggestion? We've heard what should happen. What could happen? Are there things that as a community we can still do, even if we can't do them the way we did before?
Well, I'll jump in there quickly, I guess, and wait for Bill in a minute. People can step into the public sphere from wherever they are and write and speak and help overcome the reticence that people have and help inspire courage in others. So they're and will get there in a lot of different ways. In other words, we won't have to agree on everything, but we are seeing a decline in public participation. There's a lot of reason, but people are frightened, people are alone, and people can come together as Veterans for Peace comes together and make progress however that small group wants to make progress. One more thing that was on a slide that I didn't mention is that we can change our mentality in a more practical way and build resilience in our communities. I'm not very confident in the government's choosing the right thing, like you said. People can do these sort of things ourselves, and we can build microgrids. We have the power of example like that. So that's a short answer. And it changes our mentality. That's the thing that a lot of people aren't. The constructive program has been missing from the protest movement. And Gandhi always told us that was really the bigger part.
Yeah, well, I think you put your finger on a chronic problem, which is it's easier to describe in exquisite detail the powers we're up against than to figure out how to act against them. But there's a lot of seeds of a movement. There's progressive veterans. I think a lot of the people working on Gaza ceasefire are going to stay in anti-military work. The Poor People's Campaign is trying to bring back kind of the spirit of MLK and stopping the war machine as a piece of what they do. I think the challenge is you can't go to somebody who's concerned about police violence or climate change or things that affect them very deeply, and just say, put that aside and work on this. Therefore, how do we work together? How do we support them? How do they support us? And I think part of that, I think Greg was getting at, is different people will take different levels of risk. I worked for many years with Frida Berrigan, and of course her family put their lives on the line, did jail time. Not everybody's going to do that. But to me, that was an inspiration to myself to say, well, if they're willing to do that, I have to do more. So I think people can act at all different levels, but they have to act. And part of acting is thinking that you can make a difference. And I think part of that has to do with kind of retelling our history, because the powers that be are never going to admit that something we did caused a change. In the 80s, Francis Fitzgerald had a book about Reagan and Star Wars. And at some point, one of his folks sent him a memo and said, this anti-nuclear thing is getting out of hand. It's not just peaceniks, it's mainline churches, it's small towns. You have to do something. Unfortunately, he had two branches. One was Star Wars, bullshit people into thinking we can protect them with technology. But I think it did make him more open when Gorbachev made some real proposals. But you're not going to hear anybody say that. They're going to say Reagan, won the Cold War by spending a lot of money on the military. So somehow we have to recapture that history, because I think that's the only way people can understand that we've made a difference before. And I think now, with such a fractured media environment, so much disinformation, so much rancor, it's harder. But I think also part of it is kind of old school, which is, talking to people, not just on social media, but directly. So, it's a tough problem, but I do, every time I talk, I try to like kick myself in the side and say, all right, don't spend 90% of the time about how big the problem is. And I need to still train myself. I almost feel like I should start with stories of things that people have accomplished before I dig into, the powers that we're up against. But I mean, I think that's got to be, we have to spend more time thinking about that than about the powers that be, if we're going to make progress. So I'm glad you brought that up.
And I think making the small gains as well are important. I mean, albeit, okay, getting compensation for downwinders is just part of the story, and there are other things, but nevertheless, it's all little pieces in the puzzle. But I did want to, maybe for you, Bill, just ask a question that maybe people still wonder, and that that is about sort of the proverbial pressing of the button, because you've both talked about the kind of the ramping up, this kind of unfettered spending. We can have as many weapons as we want. The whole idea of adhering to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and actually downgrading and diminishing your arsenal seems to have gone out the window. But is it the case then that any president has, because we're looking at the possibility of any president has the power and the capability alone to press the button? I mean, how simple is it if we're on that precipice of a risk of nuclear war? How simple is it if you've got the madman in the White House theory in play for that actually to happen? I mean, Greg, if you want to jump in too as well. I mean, that's
yeah. Well, I think on paper the president can do it, but obviously there's a chain of things that have to happen. So I think the question is, would people along the way refuse an order? And because if they're like good soldiers and I'll do whatever the president says, we're in much deeper trouble than if somebody's going to stop and say, no, that's a bridge too far. I refuse to do that. Yeah, I think that's the problem. And you don't know what's in people's minds, but I think if you can create a consciousness of what a horrific thing this is, just as we had, soldiers abandoning in Vietnam and resistance inside the military and so forth, there's got to be sort of like a nuclear resistance that goes beyond those of us who have no power over that moment, and seeps into the consciousness of people that are inside that process. And how we know that that's happening, I mean, it's hard to say, but certainly dialogue is part of it.
Yeah, I would like to just add that I agree with everything that Bill said. We have to assume that the people involved are highly trained and highly routinized, and that we have to assume they will obey the commander-in-chief. And they might not, but we mustn't allow ourselves to get in a situation where the people in the chain, from the president himself and or herself and all the way down, actually think that this is a good idea. And we're very close to that point right now.
And I would just add, the things that advocates of nuclear weapons say every day are insane, and yet they're treated seriously. Oh yes, we must destroy the world in order to make a point. Why does that make sense? And yet a lot of people nod along because of the conditioning that's happened.
Well, you certainly, I mean, I've also been to this nuclear deterrence summit once, and it was, shocking to hear the sort of rhetoric of talking about all of this as if, it was talking about M&Ms or something. It was all perfectly okay. It was all completely in the abstract, and there was no sort of element of putting the human face on it or thinking about what would actually happen to human beings and all life. It was so sort of technical, and we had some interesting conversations in the break about this. I mean, I tried to, but yeah, they're sort of in this, I don't know, in this strange, almost robotic kind of thinking where there's no humanity and no feeling, no sense of morality in a way.
Yeah, and even the people who might be cynical and they're just in it for the money, they're not true believers, are endangering us because they're helping build these things, and they're not pushing back in the other direction. So it's, yeah, there's a lot of lack of accountability in all this. And somehow we just have to break through the public consciousness that more is better, which a lot of people still seem to think, even after all the disastrous wars of this century. People say America is going to be the most powerful country in the world by spending more on the military. You would think there would be enough evidence already to show that that's not the case, you know.
But we've also got the challenge, I think, of the corporate media, you know, which we haven't really talked about in terms of, you know, we've got the right messages, but it's very difficult to, you know, to get those messages to the people where they are, because the means by which they will receive them are controlled by a corporate media which has an agenda to parrot the sort of party line of the government. And so, I mean, at least my sense is that there's a lot of independent media, but you know, that tends to be preaching to the choir, as we were talking about earlier. And how do we sort of break beyond that? That's I'm interested about that, you know, that challenge that you might have faced as well, getting the word out.
Yeah, I view the mainstream media as the best you can do is get a bumper sticker in there once in a while. You know, like they do 32, paragraph 32, after like making the case for the other side, they say, oh, here's somebody who disagrees. And even friends of mine who read or see this stuff say, oh, I saw you were on TV, but they don't remember, you know, what I said because it was 30 seconds. So it's not worth like strong effort, but somehow we have to build independent media in ways that will reach people. And I think there's certainly a generational aspect. I was on a show done by a guy named Johnny Harris. I had never heard of him. I looked on his page. He gets 2 to 4 million hits per video. And all the younger people I know were like, saw you on Johnny Harris. I was about to call you. I saw you on Johnny Harris. So there seem to be places, but I think on the other hand, you've got the stereotypical person sitting back in their rocking chair watching Fox News. There's more of that than there should be, you know. So, but I think building up the independent media is probably our only hope, you know, because I know a lot of reporters who would like to go deeper, and their editors just won't let them, you know. Not to mention that there's fewer of them.
There's another side there that I would like to bring out. To quote Johann Galtung, public opinion is not a significant variable in foreign policy. And as we know in this country, the views of citizens are not correlated at all with policy outcomes, as Princeton and Northwestern University found in a long study. What is correlated are organized, very wealthy people, business organizations, and other organizations. And I think that we mustn't neglect and must work on the powers that be, which are interposed between the public and Congress and the executive branch. So we have, for example, we have a lot of Russophobic statements coming out of arms control groups, Russia's unprovoked aggression, etc. And there's a lot of ignorance behind all that. And with those organizations having, you might say, pride of place in Congress, and Quincy being a wonderful exception to the trend, it is difficult that the views of people at the grassroots are cut off. And this started, in our experience, in the mid-90s with the NPT Review and Extension Conference, when many senior people in the foundation world and in NGOs insisted that the Non-Proliferation Treaty not contain any more details or time-bound measures for nuclear disarmament. So nuclear disarmament was taken out of the NPT in part because of people that we know. And so we have we need to be able to confront and convince and help educate, not just on the grassroots, but also in Washington, in the NGO community, in the foundation community, and among those who are most influential in our society, which you all know anyway, but anyway, just had to be said.
So-
I don't want to keep yakking. Linda, do you have other stuff you want to say about that question?
Well, okay. I actually have to intercede. I realize that we have about 3 or 4 more minutes left, and I wanted to do a go round, but absolutely, Linda or anyone else did. I did have one quick question. Time has really gone by, and it's vital that we all stay in touch with you, and we will put out your information. But Jerry Condon, who Veterans for Peace, had a question that you're touching on, if I may jump in here. That seeing that it seems that we're not able to achieve progress with the abolition of nuclear weapons right now, the way we're heading. But he was asking, should we therefore be doing other things, which you've alluded to, focusing on the downwinders or whatever, but pushing to end the war in Ukraine, pushing to end the genocide in Gaza, shifting some more of our focus to, maybe stopping the constant push to invade Iran, terminate the preparations for war against China, and instead, and this is my point, what I've been going around, and Greg, you witnessed it at the summit. I've been saying we need to survive this planet. If humanity's going to make it, and I think we can, we need China, Russia, and Iran to be our allies. We need to be allies, and to keep. So this, to me, and you know who gets this is the youth. I find the youth, and they're on their machines. They are talking to each other. So as we did in the 70s and 80s, we were busy building bridges with Russia, and in regards to the reducing the enemy talk. There's no doubt our weapons all are made and built up, and the money flows because we have quote unquote enemies. So to interrupt, let's do a quick go round. A wrap with your thoughts, but that's my thought, is anything we can do to interrupt when our country, our nation stands up and starts talking about an enemy, that's time to go start building a bridge with whoever they're talking about. Iran, go there. So let's maybe do a go around, and never mind my question, but that, or my thought there. That's maybe 1 or 2 minutes each, and thank you.
Well, there was a lot of discussion about the Oppenheimer film, which left out so much. But the one thing it made me think about was Joseph Rotblat, because he actually resigned from the program, and he helped start the international pugwash movement, which created dialogue across nations on these issues. And I think we need an international movement. When I was a student, it was, let's give solidarity to, people under apartheid and so forth. Our country needs solidarity too. This whole idea of U.S. exporting democracy, what kind of democracy do we have? So I think it's a two-way street. We can support movements elsewhere, but they have a lot to teach us. Hopefully not including how to live under a fascist dictatorship, but nonetheless, I think global ties will strengthen us even as we need to build up internally.
I didn't want to suggest that nuclear abolition be dropped while focusing on preventing war. I think they're perfectly compatible, and so I just wanted to be sure and clarify that we just can't be making enemies out of the people that we need to someday sign a treaty with, someday soon. I really loved it when Jeffrey Sachs said not long ago, President Biden needs to just pick up the phone and say, we need to talk. And by the way, we're not going to have a nuclear war with you, and then pick up the phone and talk to the American people and say, we're going to negotiate a peace. And it seems from where we usually say it impossible, but it isn't impossible. It just has to start with something like that. And to go back to Linda's question, we as individuals can also carry on citizen diplomacy as well. We can learn, we can travel, we can still travel and meet people and overcome and come back and tell a story. At the very beginning of the study group, I was very moved by a woman in Santa Fe who was one who made a trip to Russia and brought back her slides and gave a talk. And this sort of thing is we can still do. And many of our friends have done so. Thinking of our dinner in New York, Anthony.
I think we need to keep putting the human face on the story. You know, we do tend to talk a lot about numbers and technology and geopolitical issues. But if we, you know, what's really galvanized, I think, especially the young people around Gaza, is seeing a genocide unfolding live on video before their eyes and in photographs every single day. You know, we're witnesses to the horrors of this in real time, and that has galvanized an immense outpouring of opposition, not big enough, but getting there. And so that's what lights people up. You know, in other words, if seeing the horror of this lights people up, then we need to tell the stories with the faces of the people to whom it has happened. And actually, preferably, they need to tell their own stories, because, you know, we do tend to be a bunch of white people, as we are today, talking about what's happened to people of color, indigenous communities, third world communities, what could happen, what should happen. We need to open up the floor for those people to tell their own stories, to show their own photographs, to show their own videos, because that, I think, does change. It does motivate people, perhaps in a more empowering way, because they can see that they're really helping someone, as opposed to the sort of horror of, oh my God, you know, we're just all going to be annihilated by nuclear war, so it's all hopeless. You know, it's very hard. I mean, I admire both you, Greg, and Bill, for doing this so longer than me, because it is so challenging and depressing and seemingly insurmountable and so horrific. But I think the human stories are what will help people jump on board. And there's a whole community of people out there that can see what's happening under the climate crisis, that can see what's happening in Ukraine, that can see what's happening in Gaza, who will feel motivated to support humanity and a humanitarian effort and peace.
Yeah, I think that means a lot of listening too, and trying to cut that gap between, you know, you got to listen to the experts. We shouldn't mimic the model of the other side, you know.
The youth really respect and need your guidance, but yes, it's time to listen to them, and I love the idea of them leading so much right now, and but they have such wonderful resources. And Linda, you are telling the personal stories. You each are working with that, so I feel extraordinarily thankful. There are a lot of, if we want to just do a quick shout out of some of the things that we're supporting right now. I know there are 2 bills in Congress. I know Warheads to Windmills is lobbying in July 8th and 9th. Back to the Brink is continuing with their lobbying. Cities are passing resolutions. We do have the youth movement standing up, and we have a presidential candidate, Jill Stein, who said she's going to sign the treaty. So there are many other ways that people are. We have the golden rule still sailing, teaching about war and how to push back on war and nuclear weapons. So I can't thank you enough. You are an inspiration to me and to all. I thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Veterans for Peace, very much for this moment. And I look forward to gathering more people on this call. I want to thank you for hanging with us. The information will be sent to you of these 3 beautiful, brave people that are working all their lives on this. So we'll get that to you. And in touch, I look forward to seeing you all on the path.